And that is what is such a sad matter, where people like my daughter leave and then they color everything in with these lies of bitterness and present it to many and defile many.
ERIKA BORNMAN, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from Cape Town, South Africa. You are a writer and educator, having released a memoir about growing up in and eventually escaping KwaSizabantu, a Christian mission based in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Although set up as a community of equality and idealism, your experience there was one of fear and abuse. Welcome to the show, ERIKA. Your book is certainly opening a lot of eyes in regards to the KwaSizabantu mission. And you've just returned from speaking out about your experiences at the International Cultic Studies Conference.
Hey, Mark, so lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. I actually didn't attend the conference in person. I was lucky that it was a hybrid conference, so I was able to attend it virtually from my home in Cape Town. So yeah, I've been very heartened by the amazing reception my book got. It's been out for almost 2 years now, but just this week I got a direct message on social media from someone in the Netherlands who had been part of KwaSizabantu since the 1990s or the late 1980s, because they remember me from the 1990s, and said that they left in 2022, so last year, and thanked me and said that my book was actually instrumental in helping open their eyes. So, I get these messages from people who have actually been at KwaSizabantu and who've left, and it's very, very heartening, to get messages like that.
Well, before we dive into the world of KwaSizabantu mission and why you were compelled to leave, let's go right back to the beginning. ERIKA, what are your earliest memories, and can you recall anything that might have set the stage for a life as part of a religious community?
So I was born of South African parents, but in Malawi. My dad was a teacher at a mission school there. And all three of us children, I'm the youngest of three, we were all born in Malawi. I don't have any memories of Malawi. We came to South Africa just before my fifth birthday. So, yeah, I have no memories. So, anything I know about our time in Malawi is what I've been told. Um, my earliest memory is of my dad and I playing, and him teaching me to whistle. We were walking through a vineyard. That's really my earliest memory. We were attending a mainstream church here in South Africa, the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a huge Afrikaans church. And there wasn't really anything unusual, I think. There was nothing really that set us apart as about to join a weird religious community.
After living only a few years in South Africa, everything changed the day a particular preacher came to town. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. My mother went to listen to somebody preach. There is a spa with a hot spring just outside Worcester, which is the town where we were staying at, Gaudini Hot Spa. And this preacher from KwaSizabantu Mission came to preach. My mother went to listen. The KwaSizabantu Mission is, I don't know, about 2,000 kilometers across the country in what was then Natal, because we're in apartheid South Africa here in the 1980s. And now the province is called KwaZulu-Natal. And my mother believed that this person had, or this place that this person came from, had the answer to all her problems. And pretty soon after that, my father was offered a job as a teacher in a town called Escort, which was very close to KwaSizabantu in Natal. So I would have been around 7, 8 years old when we packed up and moved across the country to this town called Escort.
And she says, I'm bound with chains of hell. Can Jesus set me free? And she was set free completely. She surrendered her life to Christ. She was prayed for. And she was set free. And you know what the expression of a face of an old witch is like. But when Christ came into her life, it changed. And she looked like a saint who had lived in the presence of the Lord for years. She says, oh, it's so wonderful, Lord Jesus, that you've set me free. Within 2-3 days, more happened than the previous 12 years of hard labor on the mission field.
ERIKA, can you give us an overview of the history of the KwaSizabantu mission and what they believe?
Yeah, so it was originally a congregation in Pietermaritzburg, which is one of the cities in KwaZulu-Natal, run by a German South African called Anton Engelbrecht. And he had a young man called Elo Stegen, who was part of his congregation. And Elo Stegen then rose up in the ranks and basically took over this congregation. Elo Stegen's brother then bought him a farm where he set up camp, because around 1966 he believed that revival had come. So he was mainly a preacher to the Zulu nation, and so there was this big thing, there was revival among the Zulus, and they claim that, you know, the Holy Spirit came down and it was a big gust of wind and everything. They claim that that people were healed of blindness, of leprosy, of being paralyzed, you name it. People were healed. Not that, you know, those people were ever seen, but it was claimed. And very soon this community started farming. They started building buildings, and it grew into a huge community, and then eventually a huge commercial enterprise. Remember, this is apartheid South Africa, where races were segregated, and KwaSizabantu's the farm's location was on the border between the white Natal and the black Zululand. So it kind of was an ideal place for people of all colors to come. It was purported to be this multiracial utopia, and I know that's what drew my father to the place. And yeah, then it just kept growing, and they eventually had branches all over Europe, in America, in Australia, in Russia. So they became quite powerful, but also because they were very enterprising, and because everybody there was basically working for food and lodging, they became very industrious and established a big farming operation. Many years later, they would discover water, and they owned the largest bottling plant in Southern Africa, or South Africa at least. So they're an enterprising bunch. They don't belong to any denomination. So, like many other of these religious institutions, there is no governing body. You know, they're not accountable to anybody. Since 1977, at least, some of the evangelical leaders in South Africa tried to intervene, tried to get them to see, you know, you guys are turning into a little bit of a cult. But they rebuff all efforts to have anybody question them or hold them accountable. They, you know, your viewers who listen to Anke Richter's chat with you about Gloria Vale, there are so many similarities between Gloria Vale and KwaSizabantu. So I first heard of Gloria Vale when people who found out about KwaSizabantu, who knew Gloria Vale, drew the comparisons. And so, you know, they're a law unto themselves. One of the things that sets them apart is they believe in confession of sin. So your salvation isn't guaranteed at any point in time if you have any unconfessed sin in your life. So if we were always told God might come take you at any time. So in the evening, if you had sinned during the day, and it could be as silly as something of as feeling just a little bit of irritation because your mom asked you to wash the dishes, and you died with that unconfessed sin in your life, you would go straight to hell, regardless of anything that had gone on before. So you lived in constant fear of going to hell. Um, Hell was a very real place for us. They showed us movies like The Burning Hell. We felt like I lived in fear, constant fear of dying and going to hell. And this practice of having to confess your sins. So you have a counselor who's one of the what they call the co-workers, which is the top hierarchy of the place. Um, and they pray with you, so they hear your confession and they pray with you that God will forgive you, and then you're okay. Then if you die, you go to heaven. Of course, this practice means that they know everything that's going on in everyone's thoughts. You're encouraged to snitch on other people, because if you know of someone's sin and you don't confess it, then you are as guilty as them. So if you saw somebody do something wrong and you don't go and snitch, then and you die that night, then you're going to go to hell for their sin, basically. So it allows you a very tight control. It also, which we can talk about, allows men to have access to young girls and young women who know nothing about sex, because sex education is banned, and they have them alone for counseling. So it's a ripe environment for abuse.
Well, it wasn't long after moving that your parents made a decision that left you and your siblings on your own. And this was the beginning of some very difficult years for you. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I was 9 years old, and my father was a missionary at heart. I mean, I would love to have a discussion with him now, but I can't. He died, about what it is about mission work that appealed to him. But he was a good man. Anyway, he wanted to go to France to learn French so that he could go into French-speaking Africa. And my mother joined him. And they believed that they were leaving us in a safe place, because my parents were good parents up until that point. Strict, but we never doubted their love for us. It was a normal home, and there were some high school children whose parents, these are all white children I'm talking about, whose parents lived in Johannesburg, which is a city, I don't know, about 1,000 kilometers from there. And they wanted to remove their children from the evil that is in this world. So they sent their children to live at KwaSizabantu, and then every day take the bus 50 kilometers to Stanger, which was a town on the coast, where they would then go to school, and then they would get bussed back. So they basically lived in kind of a hostel setup, very close to hostile, but hostel setup. And my brother and I were younger than those children, but we were nonetheless left there as well. And my parents went to France, and so suddenly we were left on our own. And we were separated. Boys and girls don't really speak to each other, aren't allowed to speak to each other, and that kind of filters through into sibling relationships as well. So my relationship with my brother kind of became non-existent. My sister was 4 years older than me, so she was already in high school. And when you're 9 and 13, 9 and 13, that's actually quite a big age difference. So I was very much on my own. Luckily, I'm a reader, so I would take out 2 books at the school library every day, read on the bus, read back at this place we were now forced to call home. But life was awful there. They rule through fear, as I've alluded to before, with showing movies like The Burning Hell and that. But the other way they rule through fear is by beating children in public. So we would be called to this room called the upper room. It was called that, a very pretentious name, I think, because you climb some stairs to get up to it. Or room number 5, which was on the ground floor. And children would be hauled out in front of everyone. Either someone had confessed something or they'd been seen to do something wrong, and they would get beaten. You, that fear, because you never quite know exactly what the rules are, because they're quite random also at times. It can be something as stupid as you have a Nike sign on your t-shirt, like, and this means you're serving the devil. I recall I was 9 or 10 years old, and there was a young 8-year-old girl that I was kind of friendly with, and she had been seen by another child to have taken some toffees out of another child's suitcase and eating them. And this child snitched, because that's what we're taught to do. And we were all called to the upper room, and this girl, I'm going to call her Jessie, because that's what I call her in my book. She was told that the Bible says that thieves get their hands cut off, and so they brandished a big butcher's knife and then the pipe. This was a plumber's pipe that they used to beat children with. It was often filled with sand to make it heavier. So it was the knife or the pipe. And, obviously now as an adult, I know that they weren't going to cut off her hand. But as a child, I believed that that was entirely possible. And also, I I had to believe that this was the will of God, because they were the living embodiment of God's will on earth. And the thing is that we had to always watch these punishments without showing any emotion, because if you were crying with the child who was being beaten, then that meant that you were in sympathy with their sin, and then you would probably be next. So you learn to just, show no emotion. And obviously, I think that's where I first started dissociating as well. You just leave your body, because being in your body is just too awful. They didn't cut off her hand. She got an incredibly awful beating. Uh, so so yeah, they ruled us through fear. But then I had this other world. It's the school. I was always a good student, and a very gregarious child. So I had these two worlds: this amazing, lovely life at school, where I was popular and my teachers liked me, my classmates liked me, and then I had to become this little shadow child. And I became this little shadow child. At the age of 10, I started wetting my bed at night again. Now I know that's a serious sign. But yeah, it was, those were terror-filled days. Yeah.
Well, eventually your parents returned, but you chose not to speak out at this time about the abuse you saw, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I asked my brother when I was writing my book whether he ever told either my mother or my father, and he said no. I think for me, as a 10-year-old child, it was twofold. On the one hand, I knew my father would be very upset if he knew that we had been distressed. But on the other hand, they had left us there, and they believed that this place did the will of God. So there was a little bit of the indoctrination that had already started, really taking root, that who am I to rebel against God's will, you know? So I never told my parents. And we moved to Johannesburg, and we lived there for 3 years. Actually, I would have been 11 when they came back. So we moved to Johannesburg. We lived there for 3 years. And my father worked for a mission organization that wasn't associated at all with KwaSizabantu, which we call the mission for short. So if I could talk about the mission, I'm talking about KwaSizabantu. While we were there, we would still return for the big school holidays. We would still go back to KwaSizabantu because they have these big youth services. That's actually happening this week as we speak, every year. And on Sundays, we would go to someone's house who was kind of in charge of the whole Johannesburg region, Waldemar Engelbrecht. And then when I was 15, my dad told us one day that we're moving back to KwaSizabantu. And I was like, no. They were starting one of South Africa's first multiracial schools. What I didn't know at the time, it was because the South African government had decided to introduce sex education into the curriculum. And KwaSizabantu was like, not our children. So they decided to start a school so that they could control what their children were being taught. And they'd asked my father if he would be principal of the school. And my father thought, these are good people, and he said yes. And so we left our home in Johannesburg. My brother had been elected a prefect. It was his final year of school. He stayed behind with friends, and my sister had enrolled in her first year of studies. So she stayed up there as well she was going to study metallurgical engineering. And so I was the only one to move down with my parents. And I thought to myself, it's not going to be that bad because my dad is going to be there to protect me, And then the day before school opened, he died of a heart attack. He was 43 years old, so really young. I was 15. I found out many years later that the night before he died, he had phoned his sister, my aunt, Iris, and he had told her that he'd been demoted and he was now only going to be a teacher and not the principal, because there'd been a meeting and he hadn't agreed with some of the things that they wanted to do in the school or how they were going to, run the school. And they had said to him that, well, he can't be the principal anymore. And then the next morning he died of a heart attack. I kind of think he died of a broken heart. He did say to my aunt, what is this place that I've brought my family to? So I think he was starting to see the light, but I'll never really know. So yeah, my protector was gone, and that was an awful year. That whole first year after my father died, we didn't. He was meant to be our teacher, so we were still kind of segregated, the white children and the black children. So us white kids had to study through correspondence. It was the first time I was having to study in English, even though I could speak English. I'd never had to do schooling in English. It had always been in Afrikaans. So, and now I was reading and I was grieving my dad. It was an awful year. And I didn't go to confession once. I didn't even have a counselor. And that's kind of unheard of there. At the end of that year, I was 16. My mom called me in and said that the school board had met and decided to expel me for my defiance, for not having a counselor and for not going to confession. And that because she was dependent on KwaSizabantu and this was her life now, she had no choice but to kick me out of the house. So she told me that I would have to pack a little suitcase and walk up to the main road and hitch a ride and go make a life for myself somewhere. I know now that I could have, found an aunt or uncle, and all my aunts and uncles, they would have taken me in. But of course, I was petrified, and we're in the middle of nowhere. And I have to go make a life for myself at the age of 16. I was petrified. I begged for a second chance, promised that I would find a counselor. And so I was allowed to stay. And maybe that was the plan all along, was just to scare me. But the threat of expulsion was certainly real, because they also shun people like the Jehovah's Witnesses. When you leave, you're shunned. You're out.
Well, it was when you began your counseling that a series of events set into motion your decision to leave the mission once and for all. So, talk about that.
So the one thing that I actually had control over was who my counselor would be, which in retrospect is actually quite weird that I wasn't assigned one. And I decided to ask a man who he was quite young. I think he would have been in his early 30s. Um, but when he preached, there was always something interesting, like historic or around world events or something. And he was very clever. He spoke like, I don't know, 5 or 6 languages or 7 languages. And so a very intelligent man, like my dad was. And so I asked him if he would be my counselor, and he said yes. And so I started going for counseling sessions, but which would often turn out to be lessons in history and politics. And it was actually him who taught me about apartheid and what apartheid was, because my dad didn't talk politics at home. So at the age of 16, my political education about what was happening in South Africa actually started. Like, I didn't know about the segregation. I mean, I knew about segregation, but I didn't know. As a white person, you're always very protected and privileged. So it was very eye-opening for me. And I loved the politics and the history lessons. And sometimes there wouldn't even really be any confession of sin. It would just be this incredible educational thing. And I revered this man. I adored him. I He had a daughter who'd been born with muscular dystrophy. So I started spending a lot of time with her. He was a Zulu man, so her home language was Zulu. So I started teaching her English. I would spend hours a day with her, massaging her limbs, helping her with exercises. So, I kind of poured all my love into that family. Um, and then about a year into the counseling, he started grooming me sexually. It started with hugs, and then it turned to kissing, and then it became fondling and everything. And this was very hard. So KwaSizabantu teaches us that women are the root, are evil because we exist to tempt men into sin. And this was a man of God. So I felt something was wrong, but I also knew that he was a man of God. So whatever sin there was, it was my sin. And coupled with what I was hearing about how women are, the cause for men to stumble, um, I didn't want to be in my body. I later realized it was also the only thing I really had control over was what I put in my mouth, and I became severely anorexic. Um, I didn't like the food, the communal food they cooked either. A lot of the food was quite foreign to me from how I'd grown up. Um, and I was but I was a really good actress, and I mean, I am a very gregarious, outgoing person, so that's what the outside world saw. This girl who always smiled, who didn't make a fuss, but inside I was dying. Um, and My father had a brother who was 12 years older than him, who lived in Europe, and he came to South Africa, and I basically met him for the first time. Look, I might have met him when I was a young child, but I don't remember. And he came to visit us at KwaSizabantu, and he left, and this very same aunt that my dad had phoned, he said to her, "We've got to get ERIKA out of that place." So he offered me a trip to Europe because he said, you speak French and German. This is the best place to learn the language properly is France and Germany. So he bought me, him and his wife Janet, bought me a ticket to go to Europe and a Eurail ticket for 3 months to travel around on trains. And I was 20 years old, and my mother said I was allowed to go on provision. I only stayed with people from KwaSizabantu over in Europe, which wasn't a problem because there were many of them. And that was an amazing time. I spent almost a year in Europe with wonderful families. It was in Europe that my one lung collapsed. They call it a spontaneous pneumothorax. And the doctor who examined me and who treated me said, if you don't start eating, you're going to die. And that's when I realized for the first time, there's a link between food and nutrition and and also I was much happier in Europe, so I did start eating and gaining a little bit of weight. And my aunt and uncle then offered to pay for my university studies in Europe. I told them I wanted to become a translator for the United Nations, and they said, well, then you must study at Maastricht, and they would pay for my tuition, and I would just have to get a job to help with living expenses. And I phoned my mom, super excited, and she said to me, Erica, you said you're coming home in January. You're coming home in January. Because they've given me a job fresh out of high school to teach 5-year-old Zulu kids English. So she said, you have a job here and you're coming home. Now, I was 21 at this stage and legally an adult, but I didn't know that I was allowed to say, I'm not listening to you. Because at KwaSizabantu, if you're a girl, you remain under your parents' thumb and their control until the day you're married, and then they hand you over to your husband, and then you're under his control. So you never get to make your own decisions. So I came back to South Africa, and then the rule there is if you've been away, then you have to go and you have to greet all the important people. So basically all the co-workers, you have to say, I'm back and hello, and, put yourself back under their thumb, basically. And so I went to greet this counselor of mine, and he had me up against the wall, kissing and fondling me. And I phoned my aunt, and the same aunt, Iris, an angel. And I said, please, can I come visit? And she said, yes, my child, come. And I managed to persuade my mother that I was just going to go visit her for the weekend because I had a gift from her brother in Europe, which was true. And so I packed a tiny little bag. And when I got to her, I just said, Iris, I can't go back there. And she said, you don't have to, my child. And so, yeah, I found a job as a receptionist, and I would go back sometimes to speak to my mom, but since 1996, I haven't set foot there.
Well, it's really been a long road to recovery for you, Erica. But even though you were strong enough to walk away, the influence of the mission was never far behind. And what do you say to those people who tell you to just let it go?
I say lucky them. But yeah, it has been a long road. It took me about 3 years to realize that what I had experienced and what I had witnessed was abuse and not the will of God. So for 3 years, I walked around believing that lightning was going to strike me any moment, and God was going to kill me. But I managed to break free, and I from when I realized that what I'd witnessed and experienced was abuse, I've had this absolute, just, I don't even know what to call it, conviction that with knowledge comes responsibility, and that I am responsible to try and save the children there. Now, at the time, my nieces were little kids. In fact, my third niece hadn't even been born yet when I left. And in 2000, I published an article in a women's magazine that caused a bit of a stir here about my experiences there. But the mission just denied, and everything went back to normal. And then my nieces grew up, and obviously without any input from me, because their father and mother, their sister, forbade me to have anything to do with them, because it was their God-given duty as parents to save their children from Satan's influences. And then, at the age of 47, I went and married a narcissist, and I didn't even realize it. I'd been, but I've spoken to so many survivors who have ended up in abusive relationships. Uh, we're primed for abuse. As children, we're primed for abuse. Firstly, because our boundaries are demolished. Um, Secondly, because we're taught that men are everything and women are nothing. And even though intellectually I knew that that whatever they taught me was unsound and just ridiculous, um, I hadn't managed to completely heal those wounds. And so I married this man. Our marriage lasted for less than a year, because luckily a friend encouraged me to go into therapy. I was very, very suicidal, because I just thought, I don't know how to live. It wasn't that I didn't want to live. It was just that I thought I didn't actually know how to anymore. Um, so and it was then that I realized that at the end of my marriage, August 2019, that I realized how deep my wounds actually went, and that I thought I'd put the past behind me, but that I hadn't. That it was very much alive inside me, and it was me not healing these wounds that had me marry this abusive man and basically created a cult inside my home. I married a little mini cult leader, and it was then that I thought, but I didn't have it as bad, especially as the black children had it, because even though they meant to be this multiracial utopia, they definitely extremely racist, and the black children were tortured. There is no other word for what they went through. And I thought, if me, who had it relatively easy, was carrying all these deep wounds, what about everybody else? And then that just really raised it again for me. Like, what about the children growing up there? And then I started hearing things, and meeting up with other people who had left, and started hearing things about KwaSizabantu and realizing that nothing had changed there. And so I contacted News 24, which is South Africa's largest online news organization, and they believed me. They believed us. They spent 7 months investigating the place, and they published an expose called Exodus, with an award-winning podcast, a documentary, many articles. And you know what? That came out in September 2020, and they're still on the story. So I'm very grateful to them. And that led to Penguin Random House offering me a publishing contract for my memoir, which I then wrote, and and published. Like, it was on the shelves less than a year after I'd signed the contract, so it was a quick turnaround there. Found out, well, I had known that the man who had molested me, my counselor, he had left KwaSizabantu, and he's currently serving a sentence for murder. He'd gone ahead and murdered a woman for money. And this is very much in the public eye in South Africa, but KwaSizabantu continues with impunity, because I believe that they are being protected by people in government. They are super wealthy. All the retail stores carry their products and are very unwilling to not carry their products. And so, we'll see. We'll see what happens next. And as for not letting it go, I think I've healed enough that I potentially could let it go, whatever letting it go means. But the harsh reality is that my past is still the present for the children who are living there. And my nieces have now had children. And that continues. The school still continues. The man who's the chairman of the board at the school is the person that I witnessed with my own eyes, meting out some of the worst abuses possible. They used to beat the black children, especially. They used to beat them in public until they were bleeding. They would often make them remove their clothing before they did that. And this is a man I saw with my own eyes beat children, and he's in charge of the school, So nothing has changed. They've shown zero remorse. They keep saying, oh, there were some individuals. I know of 3 pedophiles they protected. And 2 of them they allowed to leave quietly out into the world. I know of incidences of rape where the leader of the mission told the girl to just be quiet, confess her sin of making a man of God stumble, and not tell anyone about it, including her own mother. This was said to more than one young woman, boys were molested, and there's not an ounce of remorse. And where there's no remorse, there's no change. So we're fighting to have South African authorities hold them accountable, but it's an uphill struggle. But we're not giving up. So no, I'm not going to let it go. Not while there are still children there. Yeah.
ERIKA, you mentioned shunning. So what are things like with your family now?
Well, I have my brother. My brother also left, and we are very close, and he is my rock, and my book is dedicated to him. I love my brother. My sister and my mother and my sister's 3 daughters are all still part of KwaSizabantu. My mother disowned my brother and I in 1996, and she said, unless we are willing to accept Alo Stegen as our spiritual leader, we are not her children. She hasn't said that she didn't do it, but my brother and I both remember it, so we know that she did it. And also it's KwaSizabantu policy. They have broken up many families. After the News 24 investigation came out, there's a constitutional body in South Africa called the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Communities. It's a whole mouthful, but the CRL Rights Commission in short. And they launched an investigation, which they have not completed, even though it's almost 3 years later. But my sister testified at their one hearing, and basically said that I'm a liar. My mother went on the pulpit, one of the few times a woman preaches a whole sermon, and denounced me as a liar from the pulpit.
But my youngest daughter,
kodwa ile encane indodakazi
who grew up in the same home,
ekhule ekhaya elifanayo,
who had the same mother and father,
inobaba nomama oyedwa
who
nalenye,
came at the same time to KwaSizabantu mission,
naye yafika KwaSizabantu ngesikhathi esifanayo nalabo abanye.
she allowed a root of bitterness in her life that she did not deal with.
Yavumela impande yokubaba empilweni yayo, yangayisebenza lempande.
And that root of bitterness grew,
Lempande yokubaba yayisikhula,
so that eventually she could not stay any longer in the home.
So I would say that I am definitely one of the most hated people there. And my mother and my sister and my 3 nieces, well, they're not in my life at all. Yeah.
Your book, Mission of Malice, is out now, and you've recently spoken at the ICSA conference along with another survivor of the KwaSizabantu mission. It's incredible work that you're doing to raise awareness about coercive groups, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to come on to the show today. I will leave links to your book and social media in the description below, and hopefully we can have you back on the show in the very near future.
I would love that, Mark, and thank you so much. When I left KwaSizabantu in the 1990s, I was on my own. And today, people who leave coercive groups have this online community and people like you who are helping spread the word. And, we're never going to know how many people aren't joining these coercive groups because of the work that you do, because of the work that I do. That's not something that anybody can count. But I do believe that what we do is so important. So thank you so very much. And yeah, well, if something happens on the KwaSizabantu front, then I'd love to come back.